The ballroom shimmered like a sea of diamonds, but Alara felt only the cold tide of invisibility. She stood near the towering marble pillar, her gloved fingers curled around a champagne flute she had not sipped from, watching her husband dance with Lady Catherine Whitmore. The Duke of Thornbury's hand rested on the small of the woman's back with an ease that had never been offered to his wife. He leaned closer, murmuring something that made Lady Catherine laugh, a light, musical sound that cut through the string quartet's melody. Alara's throat tightened until breathing became an effort. 3 months of marriage, and she had never once been the woman in his arms at a ball. She had never received that smile, the slight, crooked tilt of his lips that softened the hard lines of his face. She was the Duchess of Thornbury, yet she stood alone while the ton whispered behind their fans. Poor thing, married for duty, they say. He hasn't even looked at her tonight. Her family was nearly ruined. He did it out of honor to her late father. One cannot expect affection in such an arrangement. The words drifted to her like shards of glass. Alara set down the untouched champagne and quietly slipped away through the terrace doors, the night air cool against her heated cheeks. Not a single head turned to mark her departure. She had entered this marriage with the fragile hope that duty could blossom into companionship. She had been so terribly wrong. The story of how she became the Duchess of Thornbury began 6 months earlier, in a damp solicitor's office in London. Alara Wren had just buried her father, a kind but imprudent baron who had left behind a mountain of debt and a crumbling estate. Her younger sister, Beatrice, had wept into her shoulder, and Alara had felt the weight of the world settle onto her bones. There was no money, no prospects, and the distant cousin who inherited the title had made it clear they would be turned out within the month. Then the letter arrived, thick cream paper sealed with the Thornbury crest. The Duke of Thornbury, Alexander Vance, offered his hand in marriage, not to Alara specifically. His solicitor's wording had been painfully formal, but to the eldest daughter of Baron Wren, as a matter of honor. The late Baron had once saved the previous Duke's life during a hunting accident years ago. This was the repayment of a life debt. Alara had stared at the letter until the ink blurred. She did not know him. She had seen him once at a distance during a London season years ago, a tall, dark-haired man with a face like a winter landscape, beautiful and cold. He had stood apart from the other gentlemen, observing rather than participating. She remembered the way her heart had stuttered at the sight of him, a foolish, girlish reaction she had buried deep. She accepted, for Beatrice, for the tenants who depended on the estate that would now be absorbed into Thornbury's holdings. She would be a duchess, and in return she would bring nothing but her name and a broken estate. It was a transaction. On their wedding day, Alexander Vance had been flawlessly polite. He stood at the altar, tall and unreadable, and spoke his vows in a low, steady voice. His gray eyes, the color of a winter storm, brushed over her face without lingering. At the wedding breakfast, he had spoken to her only when necessary, spending most of the meal in quiet conversation with his steward and several political allies. When she had tentatively placed her hand on his arm, he had stiffened almost imperceptibly, and she had withdrawn it as if burned. That night he had escorted her to the Duchess's chambers in Thornbury Hall, a grand, beautiful suite of rooms far from his own, and had bid her good night with a formal bow. "Should you require anything, you have only to ring for the servants." He had not visited her since. The first weeks had been a study in silent rejection. Alara had tried. She had dressed carefully for dinner, choosing soft colors that brought warmth to her hazel eyes, and had attempted conversation across the endless mahogany table. "The gardens are lovely, Your Grace. I noticed the roses near the east fountain." Yes, the gardener has been with the estate for 30 years. He did not look up from his correspondence. "Perhaps we might walk there together one afternoon. I should like to learn more about the grounds." Finally his gaze lifted, but it was distant, as if she were a minor inconvenience. "I am occupied with matters of Parliament. You are free to explore as you wish." She had nodded, her smile fixed in place, and had not asked again. The servants noticed. How could they not? The Duke and Duchess lived separate lives under the same roof. He rode out early each morning, spent hours in his study, and often dined in town with his political associates. When he was home, he treated her with the same cool courtesy he might extend to a distant houseguest. Alara drifted through the vast, elegant rooms of Thornbury Hall like a ghost, her footsteps echoing on marble floors. The breaking point came not from a grand confrontation, but from 1,000 small cuts. There was the evening she had worn a new gown, a deep emerald silk that made her skin glow, and he had walked past her into the drawing room without a single glance. There was the dinner party where she had dared to voice an opinion on the education reforms being debated in the House of Lords, and he had silenced her with a dismissive wave of his hand. Her grace is unfamiliar with political intricacies. Let us not bore her. She had flushed crimson, her heart shriveling in her chest, while the other guests exchanged awkward glances. She did not speak again for the rest of the evening. That night, alone in her vast, cold bed, Alara made a decision. She would stop waiting. She would stop hopping for a glance, a kind word, a crumb of affection from a man who clearly saw her as nothing more than a debt repaid. She would not spend her life wilting in a gilded cage, pinning for a love that would never come. The next morning, she dismissed her lady's maid after dressing in a simple wool gown and walked into the village of Thornbury alone for the first time. The sky was overcast, the air sharp with the promise of rain, but she felt more alive than she had in weeks. The village children stopped and stared at her. A duchess, walking through the muddy lanes without a carriage or an escort, unheard of. But Alara smiled at them, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, and after a moment, a little girl with tangled braids smiled back. She found the orphanage by following the sound of crying. It was a squat, neglected building at the edge of the village, its windows grimy and its roof sagging. Inside, a harried matron was trying to comfort a dozen children with nothing but thin blankets and a pot of watery porridge. The Duke's steward had clearly been neglecting his duties, or perhaps the Duke had never taken an interest. Alara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Weeks passed. The Duchess became a familiar sight in the village. She visited the orphanage every day, bringing supplies purchased with her own small allowance. She hired a carpenter to repair the leaking roof. She sat on the floor and taught the children their letters, her voice patient and warm. She did not care that she was muddying her skirts or that the village gossips were scandalized. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she had a purpose. The tenants on the estate, who had initially regarded her with suspicion, began to warm to her. She listened to their troubles, a failed crop, a sick child, a disputed boundary line, and did what she could to help. She could not command the Duke's resources, but she could offer her time, her empathy, and her quiet determination. They began to call her the People's Duchess in hushed, reverent tones. The Duke of Thornbury noticed, though he did not show it. One evening, returning from a ride, he saw her walking back from the village, her hair coming loose from its pins, her cheeks flushed with exertion and laughter. She was talking to a man he did not recognize, a tall, sandy-haired man in a physician's coat, who was carrying her basket and smiling down at her with an expression that made something tighten in Alexander's chest. He reined in his horse and watched from the shadow of the great oak tree. The man said something that made Alara laugh, a full, bright sound that Alexander had never heard from her. She tilted her head back, her eyes sparkling, and for a moment she looked so utterly happy that he barely recognized her. Who was this man? And why did the sight of him with Alexander's wife make his jaw clench until his teeth ached? He did not approach. He turned his horse and rode back to the hall, his mood dark and inexplicably turbulent. The man was Thomas Carver, the village physician, a widower who had moved to Thornbury 2 years ago. He was kind, soft-spoken, and deeply respected. When Alara had first arrived at the orphanage, he had been there tending to a child with a fever, and they had fallen into easy conversation. He did not treat her with the stiff deference of a servant. He spoke to her as an equal, and in his presence she felt like a woman, not a duchess. Thomas began to join her at the orphanage whenever his duties allowed. They would sit on the rickety benches, mending clothes or preparing herbs for the sick children, and talk about everything and nothing. He told her about his late wife, the grief that still lingered in his eyes, and she found herself speaking of her own loneliness with a candor that surprised her. "He is not cruel," she said one afternoon, her voice soft. "He simply does not see me. I am a painting on the wall, a piece of furniture he inherited along with the title. I thought I could accept it, but sometimes I feel as though I am disappearing." Thomas looked at her with such gentle understanding that her eyes stung. "You are not invisible, Elara. Anyone with eyes can see your worth. The Duke is a fool." She shook her head quickly. "No, I should not have spoken so. He is a good man in his way. He is just closed off, as if he has built a fortress around his heart." A shadow crossed Thomas's face. Then perhaps someone needs to tear down the walls. She did not know that Alexander, returning early from a meeting in town, had come to the orphanage looking for her to discuss a household matter. He stood in the doorway unseen and watched his wife lean toward the physician, her expression open and vulnerable in a way it had never been when she looked at him. A hot, unfamiliar emotion surged through his veins, sharp and possessive. He cleared his throat. Elara looked up, startled, and the light in her face flickered and dimmed. She rose, smoothing her skirts, her posture instantly guarded. "Your Grace, I did not expect you." Evidently, his voice was colder than he intended. His gaze cut to Thomas Carver, who had also risen, his expression wary but respectful. "I require a word with my wife." Thomas bowed his head. "Of course, Your Grace, I shall take my leave." He turned to Elara, his voice softening. "Until tomorrow, Your Grace." She smiled at him, a small, grateful smile that burned through Alexander like acid. As the physician walked away, Alexander stepped closer, his presence radiating tension. "You spend a great deal of time in the village." "I find it fulfilling," she replied evenly, folding her hands in front of her. "The children need care, and the estate's tenants have many concerns that have been overlooked." "And the physician, does he also require your fulfilling company?" Elara's chin lifted. There was no anger in her eyes, only a weary sadness that struck him harder than any accusation. "Mr. Carver has been a friend, nothing more. I did not think my companionship was of any consequence to you." The words hit him like a blow. He stared at her, searching for the timid bride who had once looked at him with hesitant hope. That woman was gone. In her place stood a composed, distant stranger who no longer needed his approval. Something inside him cracked. "You are my wife," he said, the words rough and unplanned. "I am well aware of my position," she said quietly. "But a wife who is never noticed eventually learns to stop waiting for a glance. Good evening, Your Grace." She curtsied, a perfect, polite curtsy, and walked past him toward the carriage, her back straight and unyielding. Alexander stood rooted to the spot, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. He had the sudden, terrifying realization that he was losing something he had never even known he possessed. That night sleep did not come for either of them. Elara lay in her bed, staring at the canopy, her heart a tangled knot of resignation and sorrow. She had told herself that she no longer cared, that she had moved beyond the need for his affection. But seeing him at the orphanage, hearing the sharp edge of jealousy in his voice, had stirred embers she thought long dead. She crushed them ruthlessly. She would not let herself hope again. Hope was a blade that had cut her too many times. In his study, Alexander sat before the dying fire, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He could not stop seeing the way she had smiled at the physician, the way her voice had warmed. He could not stop hearing her quiet declaration, "A wife who is never noticed eventually learns to stop waiting." He had been a fool, a blind, stubborn fool. He had married her out of duty, yes, but from the moment she had walked down the aisle toward him, her hazel eyes luminous with nerves and fragile hope. Something had stirred beneath the ice he had wrapped around his heart. It had terrified him. He had spent years building those walls, brick by brick, after Celeste. He had sworn never to let another woman have the power to destroy him. So he had pushed Alara away, kept her at a distance, treated her with cold civility to protect himself from the vulnerability of caring. And now she had stopped caring. The very thing he had orchestrated to keep himself safe was now his undoing. The following week brought a new trial. The Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, Alexander's mother, arrived for an extended visit. Lady Helena Vance was a stately woman with piercing gray eyes and a sharp wit that could flay a person at 20 paces. She had never approved of the marriage, not because of Alara's lack of fortune, but because she saw her son repeating his old mistakes. On her second evening, she joined Alara in the conservatory. The Duchess was tending to a potted rosebush, her fingers gentle among the thorns. "You have been good for this estate," Helena observed, settling onto a cushioned bench. "The tenants speak of you with genuine affection. That is no small feat." "Thank you." Alara's voice was cautious. She did not know the dowager well, and the woman's directness unsettled her. Helena studied her for a long moment. "My son has not made your life easy." Alara's hand stilled. "I do not complain." "Oh, you do not. You simply fade away quietly. I have seen it before." The dowager's tone softened. "You must understand something about Alexander. He was not always so frozen. Years ago he loved a woman named Celeste. She was beautiful, charming, and utterly false. She promised him her heart, then married his cousin for a higher title the moment the opportunity arose. It shattered him. He buried every soft feeling deep inside, sealed them away so he would never be wounded like that again." Alara's heart clenched, but not with sympathy, with a cold, creeping despair. Celeste, so there was another, a woman he had loved enough to be destroyed by. No wonder he had no room in his heart for a duty-bound wife. He was still in love with a ghost. "He swore he would never let himself be vulnerable again," Helena continued, unaware of the devastation she was causing. "It is not that he does not care for you, my dear. He simply has locked his heart in a vault. I had hoped that marriage might thaw him, but perhaps the damage is too deep." Alara could barely hear her over the roaring in her ears. The last fragile piece of hope she had guarded, hidden even from herself, withered and died. He was not simply cold. He was still grieving a lost love. She was a placeholder, a convenient means to fulfill an obligation while his heart remained with another woman. That night she did not come to dinner. She pleaded a headache and remained in her room staring at the wall. She did not weep. She was too hollow for tears. The next day she made a decision. She would write to Beatrice, who was now happily settled at a modest school for young ladies in Bath. She would ask to visit, to stay for a while. She could not remain here, suffocating in the shadow of a love that would never belong to her. But before she could post the letter, Alexander came to her. He found her in the library, a pen in her hand, the letter half written on the desk. He looked haggard, his cravat loosened, shadows beneath his eyes. He closed the door behind him with a soft click. "Alara." She looked up, her expression carefully blank. "Yes, Your Grace." He flinched at the formal address. "I need to speak with you, about the physician, about us." She set down the pen and folded her hands. "There is nothing improper between Mr. Carver and myself. I have already told you this. I do not see what else there is to discuss." He took a step closer, and she caught a flicker of something desperate in his eyes. "I cannot bear to see you with him. The way you smile at him, the way you laugh. You have never once smiled at me like that." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade. "You never gave me a reason to." He recoiled as if she had struck him. His mouth opened, then closed. For a long moment he just stood there, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. "I know," he finally said, the words ragged. "I know I have been blind. I have treated you with unforgivable coldness, but seeing you slip away from me, it is driving me mad." She rose from the chair, her heart pounding but her face composed. "Your Grace, I have spent months trying to reach you. I dressed for you, I spoke to you. I waited for you in empty drawing rooms hoping you might spare me a moment. I gave you every smile I had and you looked past me as if I were invisible. I will not beg for scraps of attention. I have more pride than that." "I do not ask you to beg." His voice broke. "I am begging you." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Alara stared at him, stunned. The Duke of Thornbury, the man of ice and stone, was standing before her with his walls crumbling, his eyes bright with a pain she had never imagined him capable of feeling. But she was too wounded to trust it. She remembered the Dowager's words about Celeste, the woman he had loved and lost. This was not love he felt for her. It was possessiveness, jealousy, the threat of losing his comfortable, duty-bound arrangement. She could not let herself believe otherwise. "You are confusing jealousy for affection," she said softly. "You do not love me, you never have, and I cannot spend my life competing with a memory." His brow furrowed in confusion. "What memory? What are you talking about?" "Celeste." The name tasted like ash on her tongue. "Your mother told me everything. I know you gave your heart to her years ago and she broke it. I know you are still mourning her. I will never be her, nor should I have to be." Alexander's face went pale. Then, to her utter shock, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaped him. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his composure shattering completely. "Is that what you think? That I am still in love with Celeste? Are you not?" "I despise her," he said, the words thick with vehemence. "I despised her the moment I learned what she was. She is not a cherished memory, Alara. She is a lesson. A wound that made me vow never to let myself care for anyone again because caring means being vulnerable and being vulnerable means risking utter destruction." He stepped toward her, closing the distance until she could see the silver rim of tears in his storm-gray eyes. "The memory I have been haunted by is not of her. It is of you. You walking into my hall on our wedding day with hope in your eyes. I was so terrified that if I let myself love you, I would lose you too, whether to betrayal or death or simply the slow poison of disappointment. So I kept you at arm's length. I thought if I never let you in, I could never be hurt again. But I have been a coward, and in my cowardice, I have hurt the one person who deserved nothing but tenderness." Alara's legs felt weak. She grasped the edge of the desk to steady herself. You were afraid." "I was petrified." His voice cracked. "I have loved you since the moment you stood beside me at the altar, trembling and brave, and I hated myself for it because I thought love was a weakness. I pushed you away to protect myself, and I nearly lost you because of it. But I cannot lose you, Alara. Not to another man, not to your own despair. I would tear down every wall I ever built if you would just give me a chance to make this right." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had been so certain that he did not care, that she was nothing to him. To hear this, that his coldness was born not of indifference but of a desperate, misguided self-protection, shattered the last of her defenses. "You hurt me," she whispered. "You made me feel invisible. You let me drown in loneliness while you stood on the shore and watched." "I know." He reached for her hands, and this time she did not pull away. His fingers were warm, trembling slightly. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life making up for it if you will let me. I will learn to be the husband you deserve. I will show you that my heart is not locked, it is yours, and it has been yours from the very beginning. I was just too much of a fool to say it." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, raw and unpolished. He was not the cold, distant duke she had married. He was a man who had been broken and had tried to armor himself so thoroughly that he had forgotten how to live. She took a shaky breath. "I do not know if I can trust this. I have been so wrong before." "Then let me earn it," he said, his voice a fervent whisper. "Let me prove to you that I am not the man I have been. Walk with me in the garden tomorrow. Let me listen to you talk about the orphanage and the tenants. Let me sit beside you at dinner and ask you about your day. Give me the chance I denied you." She closed her eyes, a sob catching in her throat. A part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from the possibility of more pain. But a larger part, the part that had never truly stopped hopping, whispered that this was the moment she had been waiting for. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice barely audible, "we will walk tomorrow." A shuddering breath left him. He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his mouth warm and reverent. "Thank you." The days that followed were unlike any Alara had known since her marriage. Alexander kept his promise. He met her in the garden the next morning, dressed simply, without his usual formal armor. They walked along the rose path, and he asked her about the orphanage, not with distant politeness but with genuine interest. He listened as she described the children's progress, the repairs that were still needed, and he did not interrupt or dismiss her. When she faltered, unsure if he was truly engaged, he touched her elbow gently and said, "Go on. I want to hear everything." He began to accompany her to the village. The first time he walked into the orphanage, the children fell silent, wide-eyed at the sight of the formidable Duke stepping over broken toys and ducking under low door frames. But Alexander knelt down on the dusty floor, his fine breeches bedamned, and let a small boy hand him a wooden horse. He listened solemnly while the child explained the horse's name and lineage, and Alara felt something shift and mend in her chest. Thomas Carver was still there, and the first encounter between the two men was tense. But Alexander sought him out privately one afternoon, and though Alara never learned exactly what was said, Thomas afterward treated her with the same friendship but a new respectful distance. He seemed almost relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "He loves you, you know," he told her quietly one day. "It is written all over him. I am glad for you." Lady Catherine Whitmore and the other ambitious ladies who had circled the Duke began to find their invitations to Thornbury Hall conspicuously absent. The Dowager Duchess, observing the transformation with sharp, knowing eyes, pulled Alara aside one evening. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "I told you about Celeste thinking it would help you understand his distance. I did not realize you would interpret it as lingering affection. That woman is nothing but dust to him. You, my dear, are the sun." Alara accepted the apology with grace, and the two women found an unexpected kinship. But the true healing came slowly in the quiet moments. Alexander had to learn how to be present, and Alara had to learn how to trust again. There were setbacks, an old, instinctive coldness that would creep into his voice when he was stressed, and she would flinch, and he would catch himself with visible horror and immediately soften. "Forgive me," he would say, taking her hand. "I am still learning." She would nod, her heart aching but hopeful. She saw the effort he was making, the way he deliberately set aside his papers when she entered a room, the way he asked for her opinions on estate matters and truly weighed them. She saw him struggling to break through years of emotional exile, and she loved him all the more for it. One evening, a month after his confession, they sat together in the library. A fire crackled in the hearth and rain tapped against the windows. Alara was reading aloud from a novel, her voice soft and rhythmic. Alexander was sprawled on the sofa beside her, his cravat loosened, his head resting against the cushion, watching her with an expression of such raw, unguarded adoration that she lost her place. "What?" she asked, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Nothing," he murmured. "I am simply memorizing this moment. I want to keep it forever." She set the book aside. "You are becoming quite sentimental, Your Grace." He reached up and gently caught a strand of her hair that had slipped from its pins, tucking it behind her ear. "You have ruined me, you know. I was perfectly content being a cold, miserable tyrant, and now I find myself composing poetry in my head when you laugh." "Poetry?" she laughed, and his eyes darkened with tenderness. "Terrible poetry," he admitted, pulling her closer. "The kind that rhymes Alara with tiara and makes no sense at all." She nestled against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly safe. The loneliness that had hollowed her out for so long was filled with warmth and light. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "I thought I would spend the rest of my life as a ghost in this house." His arms tightened around her. "I will never let you feel invisible again. I swear it." He tilted her chin up, his gray eyes searching her face. "Alara Vance, I love you. I loved you when I was too much of a fool to say it, and I will love you until my last breath. Can you forgive me? Can we begin again?" She did not answer with words. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a soft, tentative kiss that deepened as he responded with aching gentleness. It tasted of rain and firelight and the sweet relief of coming home after a long, cold journey. When they finally drew apart, she smiled up at him. "We have already begun." The seasons turned and Thornbury Hall transformed. The Duchess's chambers were no longer a lonely sanctuary at the far end of the corridor. They were connected to the Duke by a door that was never closed. The village orphanage received new funding and a full-time schoolmaster. The tenants began to see their Duke riding through the fields not just to inspect the harvest, but to listen, to sit at their tables and share a cup of cider. And always, he brought his Duchess with him. The Tun eventually stopped whispering about the cold Duke and his forgotten wife. Instead, they whispered about the scandalously devoted couple, the Duke who danced only with his Duchess at balls, who stood beside her at social gatherings with his hand resting protectively at her back, who looked at her as if she had hung the moon and stars. Alara never forgot the ache of those lonely months, but she used it as a foundation for strength. She knew now that she had always been worthy of love, even when she had not received it, and Alexander spent every day ensuring she never doubted it again. One golden autumn afternoon, they sat on a bench overlooking the rose garden that had once witnessed her deepest sorrow. The air smelled of earth and ripening apples. Alara's head rested on his shoulder, and his hand was laced with hers. "I was thinking," he said, "about the day we met. At the altar. Before that, at the Hastingtons ball 5 years ago. You wore a blue gown the color of midnight, and you were trying to hide behind a potted fern because you had just spilled punch on the sleeve of a rather terrifying countess." She lifted her head, astonished. "You remember that? I thought you never noticed me." "I noticed everything," he said quietly. "I noticed the way you bit your lip when you were nervous, the way you laughed even when you were mortified. I asked your name, and someone said you were Baron Wren's daughter. I filed the memory away, and when the debt of honor fell due years later, I told myself it was duty that made me choose you. But it was never just duty. It was that memory, buried deep, of a girl who laughed in the face of embarrassment and made me feel, for just a moment, that the world was not so cold after all." Tears pricked her eyes. "You never told me." "I was still protecting myself, but I am done with that." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her wedding ring. "You are my heart, Alara, my home, my one true love." She leaned into him, the last shadows in her soul dissolving into light. She had come to this place as a ghost, unseen and unloved. Now she was the very center of his world, and she knew, with a certainty that felt like the steady beat of a drum, that she would never be forgotten again. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, they sat in perfect, peaceful silence. Two people who had found each other through duty, lost each other through fear, and found each other again through the quiet, stubborn courage of a heart that refused to stop hopping.